You imagine luxury as freedom, velvet curtains, marble halls, and golden plates. But what if that beauty caged you? What if the walls you polished each day shimmered not with pride but with silence? Step into the palace, not as a guest, not as a noble, but as the one who lights the fire before dawn, the one who bows at shadows, speaks in nods, and walks backwards out of rooms. This is not your world, and yet you belong to it more than anyone else. Your breath is the first to rise into the cold morning air, and the last to fade after the final candle dies. In Tudor England, you wake not to the sound of birds but to the hiss of water boiling for a master's breakfast. If you're lucky, your straw bedding hasn't frozen. If you're unlucky, the stew you spilled yesterday will be remembered today. Your room, if it can be called that, is above the kitchens, choked with smoke, stuffed with bodies. Some sleep upright. Others lie near the hearth like dogs, daring punishment just for warmth. At Versailles the palace glitters, but you are a ghost beneath it. The Grand Commune, your prison in all but name, stinks of sweat and soot. The attic is so narrow you cannot stand upright. No privacy, no wardrobe, no heat. In the morning, you carry perfume and porcelain for a princess who does not see your face. You carry the weight of her whims like silk-bound chains. In Russia, beneath the chandeliers of the Winter Palace, you may wear scarlet, gold thread on your jacket, white gloves on your hands. But the uniform is not for dignity. It is armor against the world seeing your emptiness. The Tsar's door is your post. You do not speak. You do not move. You do not exist until someone tells you that you do. These palaces were not homes. They were stages, and you, a prop, a moving shadow in a play written by power. You served kings who dined while you starved, queens who bathed in wine while your fingers bled from polishing her mirror. You saw the food you could never eat. You changed the sheets you would never sleep in. You breathed the incense of glory, but choked on the soot of labor. You were not a slave, but you were not free. Peasants had fields. They had families. They bent to the land, not to cruelty. A farmhand might eat from his own hand. You ate only what was given. A peasant might curse the rain. You could not curse the master. If dismissed, he returned to his soil. You, to the streets, to starvation, to shame. The palace was not built for you, but it was built on you, and yet, outsiders called you lucky. They saw your livery coat and called it honor. They saw your proximity to power and mistook it for protection. But you knew better. You knew that the closer you stood to royalty, the more invisible you became. Dad Halset, the maid of Madame de Pompadour, once wrote, "They speak around me as if I were a cat or a dog, not a woman, not a voice, a listening object, a velvet pet for secrets." One footman, caught pocketing a biscuit, was beaten with a cane by Louis XIV himself. Cane snapped across his back like a snapped oath. In that moment, the king forgot his dignity, but the servant lost his. Some called you loyal, but loyalty was just another word for silence, another word for fear. In Tudor kitchens, scullions scrubbed pots until their knuckles bled, then stood still while noblemen spat on the floor beside them. The groom of the stool, one of the highest-ranked attendants, helped the king relieve himself, then bowed for the privilege. Dignity was optional, obedience was not, and yet you endured. You endured the frost of castle walls that refused to heat your bones. You endured the orders shouted, the hands that slapped, the long nights without sleep. You endured the masquerade that called your servitude a career, as if losing yourself to duty was something to aspire to. There were no mirrors for you, only reflections in puddles, warped, muddy, fleeting. You weren't allowed to fall in love. Who would marry a shadow? You weren't allowed to dream. Who dreams when every hour is accounted for? The court was a pyramid, and you lived beneath it. Hot at Versailles, they called you lucky if you had soup. At Hampton Court, they measured your worth in scraps of linen and coals. In Russia, They handed your children coins, educated them in the name of the Tsar, and those same children became revolutionaries. Servants gave their lives to the palace, and their children brought it down, because when people are made invisible long enough, they learn how to disappear completely, but not before watching everything. That is your secret. You saw the king kiss his mistress. You saw the queen cry into her wine. You saw the duke tremble after a whisper. You saw history unfold at your feet, and not one word bore your name. You were not powerless. You were unseen, and maybe that is worse, because power can be taken, but to be unseen is to be erased while still breathing. The palace was not your home. It was your test, your confession box, your coffin. You were there when the fires were lit, and when the last door was locked, you whispered the gossip that would shape kingdoms. You held the towels, the secrets, the shame. You bore witness to splendor and suffocated beneath it. You did not choose this life. You were born into the silence, and yet you made the palace move. Every step, every smile, every illusion of control depended on you. You were the one who set the table, then watched the feast from the shadows. You were the blood in the palace's veins, and the dust beneath its crown. You imagine a palace draped in velvet and soaked in candlelight, laughter echoing through gold-trimmed halls, a place where history breathes through tapestries and silver goblets. But you do not walk through the front gate. You enter from the back, and nothing is as it seems. To serve in the court of Tudor England was to vanish in plain sight. It was to stand close enough to royalty to hear their secrets, and yet be lower than a peasant, less free than a prisoner. Under the reign of Henry VIII, the court wasn't simply a royal household. It was a kingdom within a kingdom, a relentless machine of hierarchy, ritual, and control. At the center sat the king, powerful, unpredictable, and obsessed with order. Around him spiraled over 1,000 human cogs, from dukes and lords to butlers and scullions, and within that spiral, the royal servant walked a knife's edge. At Hampton Court Palace, the hub of Tudor operations, the staff population often exceeded 600 at any one time, though some records suggest over 1,000 rotated through its walls. The hierarchy was razor sharp. Even among servants there were ranks upon ranks. A gentleman of the bedchamber outranked a yeoman of the pantry. A page might hold higher status than a master cook, and somewhere beneath them all, cleaning privies and hauling ash, toiled the nameless and voiceless laborers. Each day was scripted like a play. Every movement, every bow, every glance had rules. Etiquette was weaponized, not just for the nobility, but for those who served them. For royal servants, posture wasn't just decorum, it was protection. An eye held too long could be seen as defiance. A word spoken too early might be remembered longer than your name. Most chose silence. Silence was safer. Morning began before dawn. Scullions, the lowest kitchen workers, were already awake, barefoot in stone corridors, stoking hearths and boiling water. The Tudor court burned over 1.3 million logs per year to feed its massive kitchens. That labor began with the invisible class hauling water from wells or the Thames, splitting marrow bones for broths, plucking poultry until hands bled raw. Many of these workers lived in storage lofts or by the ovens, not from convenience but necessity. There was simply no time to sleep elsewhere. Meanwhile, valets and personal servants rose to polish boots, press woolen cloaks, and lay out linen shirts for noblemen. The dressing of the body was a sacred ritual. A poorly knotted lace or a creased collar could be perceived as sabotage. The servant, therefore, had to anticipate needs before they were spoken. To fail in that was to be seen, not just as incompetent, but as dangerous. Yet even success did not guarantee safety. The infamous 1526 Eltham Ordinances, issued by Cardinal Wolsey, were designed to make the court more efficient. But for servants, they became a book of traps. These ordinances forbade loitering, restricted conversation, limited hallway access, and threatened fines, demotions, or beatings for violations as small as speaking out of turn. Royal edicts regulated everything from bathroom use to kitchen cloth storage. To exist within the palace was to live under surveillance, and if the rules were broken, punishment was swift and public. A scullion might be whipped for dropping a ladle. A chambermaid could be dismissed for laughing during prayer. In one recorded incident, a servant who failed to properly secure the privy gate was locked out in the snow all night. There were no appeals, no courts. The nobility ruled their households as mini-monarchs. The word of a baroness outweighed a servant's dignity or life. But perhaps the most insidious cruelty was not physical punishment, but psychological erosion. To serve royalty was to become invisible, not metaphorically, but functionally. Servants were expected to move like shadows, to exist only when needed, to erase all emotion from their faces. You were not a person, you were a function. You held the towel, poured the wine, bowed, retreated. Your name was forgotten, your thoughts unwelcome. Your silence was currency. Even the highest-ranking servants, the groom of the stool, for example, were not immune. This was a man who assisted the king during his most private moments, often gaining remarkable political insight. But the closeness came at a cost. His identity became fused with the throne. He was both respected and reviled, a symbol of proximity and a reminder of how far one could fall. For women, the stakes were even higher. Ladies-in-waiting lived a paradox. They were noble enough to be seen, but not powerful enough to speak. Every word was overheard. Every gesture could become a scandal. In one surviving account, a lady's maid was forced to stand barefoot for hours in a stone corridor for arriving late to a candlelight rehearsal. No excuses, no explanation, just punishment, wrapped in grace. Outside the court, peasants worked the land. Their lives were brutal, yes, but their hardships were visible. A ploughman answered to no noble. A miller could rest in his own home. Tudor servants, however, floated in a strange purgatory. They were neither poor nor free. Clothed in livery that looked regal to outsiders, they were often hungry, sleepless, and terrified. They saw the wealth but could not touch it. They smelled the feasts but could not taste them. They scrubbed the floors but could not sit on the chairs. Every day was an act of vanishing. They watched queens cry behind doors. They heard lords beg for mercy from the king. They saw power crumble and lives end, all from behind a curtain. Holding a tray or folding a cloak, they witnessed the rise and fall of marriages, wars declared over banquets, secrets traded in whispers, and they said nothing, because that was their role, to observe, never to be seen. Even their deaths were unrecorded. Few servants were ever named in royal chronicles. Their births went unnoticed, their graves unmarked, and yet they were the ones who kept the palace alive. They carried the palace on their backs, quite literally. They lifted trunks up stairwells, arranged the cutlery for ceremonies that would last hours, fetched water again and again from icy barrels in courtyards, stood in torchlit corridors until their legs gave out, ironed pleated ruffs with hot stones until their arms blistered. The architecture of the court, its dignity, its beauty, its order, was built on their exhaustion. And still, they were told they were lucky to wear the royal crest, to be part of something greater, to serve a monarch ordained by God. But there is no divinity in being whipped for spilled wine. There is no greatness in not being allowed to yawn. There is no dignity in being punished for a nobleman's bad mood. Even the act of sleeping was regulated. Many servants were forbidden to lie down during work hours, even if exhausted. They might lean on walls or nap standing up. To be caught resting without permission was to invite disgrace or discharge. Sleep was rationed. Fatigue was standard, and yet they stayed, year after year, because outside the palace walls, hunger waited, disease, vagrancy laws, and worse, obscurity without even the pretense of value. Inside the court, you were someone's servant, and outside the court, you were no one's slave. Some found pride in the work, some learned to navigate the cruelty. A clever valet might gain favor, a talented cook might be moved to the king's private kitchen, but even that favor was thin as ice. One mistake, one political shift, and everything vanished. You served not just a man, but an ecosystem of vanity, pressure, fear, and performance. You learned to breathe when told, to walk when summoned, to cry only where no one would see. And so the palace became a place where history was written and rewritten by those who never got credit, where letters were passed in silence, chambers prepared without fanfare, and lives sacrificed to make royalty appear effortless. The servants of Tudor England didn't live beneath the palace. They lived inside its bones. They were the warmth in the hearth, the echo in the hall, the hands behind the crown. And yet, history never thanked them. It barely noticed they were there. But now you know, and you will never walk through those corridors the same again. They called it the most beautiful palace in the world, a place where mirrors caught sunlight like diamonds and fountains sang beneath trimmed hedges. But behind the gold, behind the powdered wigs and embroidered coats, there was silence, a silence deeper than sleep, colder than stone, because at Versailles, silence was how you survived. You do not walk here as a guest, you serve. You rise before the sun and speak only when spoken to. You bow before entering a room, even if it's empty. You open curtains for a man who's not yet awake. You wait in a corridor for hours, just to hand him a coat, and when the king turns his back, you vanish. To the world outside, Versailles glittered. To those who lived behind its gold doors, it gleamed like a cage. Under Louis XIV, the Sun King, Versailles became the center of French power, not just politically, but physically. Nobles were drawn in like moths to the flame of royal favor, but no one was closer to the crown than the servants, and no one was more forgotten. The household of Versailles was colossal. Over 1,000 staff maintained its illusion of effortless grandeur. Yet within that number was a brutal hierarchy. Every job had sub-jobs. Every gesture was rehearsed. Every moment was surveillance. At the top were the gentlemen servants, some of whom were nobles themselves. Beneath them were the valets, footmen, pages, and grooms. Roles still visible, still movable. Further down, behind the scenes, worked the kitchen maids, linen keepers, scullions, and stable boys. The lowest lived in attics with slanted ceilings and no heat, where they shared straw mats and prayers they'd never say aloud. And all of them, high or low, knew one rule: never be noticed. To be seen too much was dangerous. To speak freely was worse. To correct a noble even gently was unthinkable. Your job was to make the court run like magic, and to never look like you existed. Take the king's morning lever, the ritual of awakening. It was not private. It was performance. Dozens of people stood silently in the bedchamber as Louis XIV awoke, dressed, and began his day. Each had a role. One held the shirt, another the breeches, someone else fetched water, while another announced the time. A valet might be lucky to perform a single action, a sleeve buttoned, a shoe placed. Before stepping back into the wall, those who failed in their duties could be punished harshly. There are accounts of servants publicly humiliated for slight delays or forgotten items. One footman was reportedly struck with the king's cane, not by accident, but as a message. When Louis XIV beat him for stealing a biscuit, the servant's back broke, but the court learned its lesson: power does not tolerate crumbs. This wasn't cruelty as exception, it was structure. At Versailles, every hallway echoed with rules. You walked only where you were allowed. You stood only where you had been trained to. You spoke only in ways that maintained the illusion. And always, you smiled. But beneath that smile was exhaustion. Servants walked miles every day across marble floors in shoes too thin to cushion the pain. They stood motionless at doors for hours, hands behind backs, blinking only when no one noticed. Some began as children, apprenticed into service before they understood what a crown was. Most never left. Their identities fused with their roles. They became objects, a valet's hand, a scullion's knees, a maid's silence. Those who lived in the Grand Commune, the servants' wing, slept among rats and soot. The ceilings were too low to stand upright. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and starch. There was no privacy, no peace. In winter, many froze. In summer, they suffocated. And yet they considered themselves lucky, because they were inside, because they had a place. Because outside, no one would remember them at all. Among the higher ranks, the pressure to maintain favor was no less crushing. A servant could rise if they pleased the right person, delivered a letter with perfect timing, or held their tongue through insult. But elevation was dangerous. To rise was to risk being seen. And at Versailles, being seen was a gamble with no safety net. Take the memoirs of Madame de Caylus, who recorded that servants were treated like pets, valuable, replaceable, and expected to be silent. Saint-Simon, another noble chronicler, described how even the most dignified courtiers could be reduced to trembling submission under the Sun King's glare. What chance, then, did a maid or footman have? Women faced layers of additional control. They were expected to smile, flatter, serve, and disappear. A lady's maid might know every secret of her mistress, from bleeding rituals to stolen love letters, but she could never speak of them. To do so would be treasonous. To make a mistake was worse. One woman, Nanan, was famously bribed by rivals to misplace a brooch. She did, and was dismissed without ceremony. She vanished from the palace and from history. These stories were not rare. They were routine. Servants were punished not just for action but for presence, for coughing in the wrong room, for tripping on a hem, for failing to anticipate a mood shift. At Versailles, to serve was to read minds and to carry burdens that no one would ever see. Even their moments of rest were performative. They could not lounge. They could not laugh too loudly. They could not be caught asleep in a corridor, even after midnight. To be tired was to be ungrateful. To be sick was to be shameful. Many took to drink. Others wept quietly behind garden walls. And still, they continued. Because Versailles offered what the outside world didn't. A structure, a cruel one, yes, a consuming one, but a structure nonetheless. You had a bed, even if it was straw. You had soup. Even if it was thin, you had meaning, even if it cost your voice. And for many that was enough. Because outside the palace, servants became nothing. Inside, they were the gears that kept time ticking. They were the ones who swept away the crumbs of diplomacy, the ones who lit the fire before treaties were signed. They were the hands behind the masquerade. No one remembers the names of those who dusted the chandeliers. No one remembers who opened the gates for the carriages that carried kings, but they were there. They stood at attention when Louis took his final breath. They cleaned the sheets where he died. They packed the perfume bottles. They folded the robes. They wept quietly, not because they loved the king, but because the palace would change. And in change, there was danger. After the Sun King's death, many long-time servants were dismissed, replaced, or sent to lesser houses. Their loyalty meant nothing. Their years of silence erased. Versailles remained, but its silence deepened. And now, as you walk its halls in imagination, you no longer see only the mirrors and the fountains. You see the boy who wiped the king's boots at dawn, the girl who fainted behind the curtain and was dragged away in shame, the valet who stood motionless for so long, his legs turned numb, the maid who slept in a stairwell because she couldn't find her bed. You see them all, and you hear the silence they left behind, because Versailles was not built on gold. It was built on obedience, on fear, on the careful, quiet sacrifice of hundreds who were told they should be grateful to suffer, and suffer they did, in silence. Versailles was a monument to power and to fear. At first glance, it dazzled. Marble floors polished until they reflected candlelight, ceilings painted with gods who looked suspiciously like the man who ruled below them. Gold trimmed everything, perfumed air, fountains that danced to music. But it was not built for comfort, it was built for control. And nowhere was that more evident than in how Louis XIV treated the people who made his world function: the servants, the aides, the nobles turned decorators in his elaborate human theatre. This was a court where proximity was peril. The closer you were to the king, the easier it was for him to break you. Louis XIV, the Sun King, understood image better than any monarch of his age. He orchestrated every detail of life at Versailles, not merely for pleasure but for dominance. He turned the palace into a stage and cast everyone around him into silent, obedient roles. Even the most powerful nobles were reduced to props, and the servants, they were the scaffolding. They held up the illusion, and when one piece cracked, he replaced it or crushed it. Every gesture in Versailles was political. Every routine was a test, and failure wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. At the king's lever, the public waking ceremony where nobles and staff dressed him like a god, dozens of eyes watched for the slightest mistake. One wrong motion could result in dismissal, disgrace, or violence. There is a chilling account recorded by Saint-Simon, one of the king's own chroniclers, of a footman who dared to pocket a leftover biscuit. When Louis XIV found out, he beat the man across the back with his cane, not symbolically, not metaphorically. He broke the cane over the man's body, sending a message that echoed down the corridors. Nothing is too small to provoke wrath. This was not a loss of temper, it was policy. Punishments in Versailles were rarely legal, they were personal, executed not by judges, but by glances, whispers, exclusions, and sudden vanishings. Nobles who displeased the king were banished. Servants who faltered were replaced without explanation. Women were shamed in salons. Men lost pensions without paperwork. One of the most feared punishments was not pain, it was being ignored. To be denied the king's gaze meant social death. You still breathed, but you were no longer seen. And in Versailles, to be unseen by the king was to stop existing altogether. Power operated through spectacle, and fear was the fuel. That fear seeped into the very bones of the palace staff. Take the royal kitchens, where chefs prepared meals with mathematical precision. Over 1,000 meals were served per day. One wrong spice, one undercooked quail, one cold sauce, and the entire staff might be rotated out. Some accounts speak of cooks trembling as dishes left their hands, not because the food wasn't good, but because it might not match a mood. And moods mattered more than merit. In the grand apartments, footmen were expected to stand motionless for hours. They were not to speak unless addressed, not to cough, not to yawn, not to shift their weight too noticeably. The floors were cold, the rooms drafty, the uniforms heavy and stiff, but endurance was expected, and failure was noted. There was a system for everything, and a punishment for every misstep. In the Queen's court, ladies-in-waiting were required to follow rigid dressing rituals. One misplaced pin could delay a procession, and delay was unacceptable. In one case, a maid accidentally handed the wrong pair of earrings to the Queen's assistant. She was dismissed within the week, her reputation shredded behind closed doors. Her name whispered as a warning, but the most brutal system wasn't written in law or enforced by guards. It was unspoken. It was how the entire court, including the servants, policed itself. People lived in fear not only of the king, but of each other. Jealousy brewed in silence. Servants competed for favor. One mistake by a rival could be a step up the ladder for you. So secrets were traded, like currency, and betrayal became a survival tactic. This created a culture where kindness was a liability. You couldn't confide in anyone. You couldn't relax. The Grand Commune, where most servants lived, was a hive of exhausted bodies and suppressed emotions. Rooms were shared by 6 or more. Bedding was scarce. Privacy non-existent. In winter, frost collected on the walls. In summer, the smell of sweat and starch was inescapable. Still, there were rules. curfews, work hours, noise limits. Any violation could be punished, even if no one ever explained the rule in the first place. For the few who gained favor, valets with charm, maids with discretion, footmen who held a noble's eye just long enough, promotion was a poisoned gift. It brought visibility, and visibility was risk. A servant elevated to personal service, say in the king's hunting party, might suddenly find himself under heavier scrutiny. If he impressed, he was kept. If he faltered, he disappeared. Records show that many favored staff were reassigned within months. Some fell ill mysteriously, others simply left and were never spoken of again. Then there were those like Nanan, a favored maid who was bribed to sabotage her mistress's appearance. She did. The result: her mistress was humiliated, and Nanan was dismissed, her name used afterward as a warning among staff. The palace was not a family, it was a machine. Every role was designed not just for function, but for submission, not just to serve, but to obey without question. Louis XIV made sure of it. He enforced dress codes so severe that wearing the wrong color to a ceremony could mark you as disloyal. He once publicly shamed a noble for arriving without lace cuffs. Another was forced to apologize in front of the entire court for mispronouncing a title. Hord, so bedleven ceramit thair, he falled. If nobles were humiliated this way, servants fared worse, and they had no recourse. No letters to complain, no unions. Only whispers, punishments, and survival. Some tried to resist, sullenly. A footman might intentionally polish the wrong shoes. A maid might fold a letter into the wrong drawer, but these acts rarely went unnoticed. The court's rumor network was faster than fire. Servants who rebelled, even quietly, were often reported by their own peers. Because in Versailles, keeping your position mattered more than solidarity. It wasn't just labor that broke people, it was isolation. The emotional toll was immense. Depression was common. Alcohol use widespread. Some staff were said to age rapidly, their bodies worn down by stress and silence. Mental illness wasn't understood, and certainly wasn't treated. You simply broke, and someone else took your place. And yet many stayed, because outside the palace was poverty, obscurity, hunger. Inside, at least you had a uniform, a role, even if it came with bruises, fear, and exhaustion, even if your life was borrowed and your peace never arrived. And so the palace spun on. The music played, the fountains danced, the chandeliers sparkled, and beneath it all, a servant stood motionless, pretending not to feel the cramp in his legs, the sweat on his back, or the fear in his chest. A maid bowed in silence, pretending not to hear the insults tossed like roses from the noble women above her. A cook stirred sauce at midnight, pretending not to know that tomorrow he might be gone. And the king, he smiled, because it all worked. Because silence is the best proof of power. Versailles was a masterpiece of design, but its brilliance came at a human cost. It was beautiful, but only if you didn't look too closely at who was holding up the mirrors. It was glorious, but only because no one dared speak the truth. It was golden, and it was brutal. The Winter Palace stood like a frozen monument to power. Its green and white facade glistened in the cold St. Petersburg air, as if it had been carved from ice and gilded with gold. To the outside world it was imperial beauty, the heartbeat of a vast empire. But behind its windows, in its basements, and behind its curtains stood another empire, an invisible one. One built not on bloodlines or crowns, but on obedience, silence, and sacrifice. This was Russia's true royal army. Not the men on horses, but the ones who opened the doors. To serve in the Romanov court was to disappear in plain sight. Tsarist Russia was a machine of ceremony. It had rules for every breath, every greeting, every silence, and at the center of that system stood the Tsar, the father of the nation. Untouchable, unquestionable, surrounded by people who bowed, curtsied, and smiled, except none of those people were truly free. The palace staff, the cooks, footmen, Valets, chambermaids, guards, laundresses, coachmen, readers, and private attendants were bound tighter than any serf. They lived within the palace walls, they breathed its rituals, and they gave their lives to its routines. To the outside world, they were privileged. They had rooms, wages, even uniforms bearing the double-headed eagle. But within the palace, they had one job: to become invisible. The Russian court, especially under Nicholas II, was layered with contradictions. Servants might come from nobility. Some were minor aristocrats, serving as ladies-in-waiting. Others were born to service. But whether high-born or poor, their fate was the same: silence. One such servant, Countess Anna Hendrikova, was among the Empress's closest companions. She was intelligent, composed, fiercely loyal, and still she was treated not as a person, but as a fixture. When revolution came, she refused to abandon her mistress. For her loyalty, she was murdered alongside the imperial family. No title protected her. No service was rewarded. This was not an isolated case. This was the rule. Servants in Tsarist Russia were raised to expect nothing but duty. A valet might rise at 4 in the morning. Before the palace stirred, he would light fires in the royal chambers, polish boots until his reflection stared back at him, and prepare tea with the precision of a surgeon. He would never sit unless told to, never speak unless asked, never contradict a command even if it meant harm. A single mistake, a wrinkled collar, a dropped spoon, could lead to demotion, or worse, because the court remembered everything. And forgiveness was not a Russian virtue, but there was something deeper, more suffocating than just rules or punishments. The court demanded emotional submission. You were not allowed to be tired, you were not allowed to be sad, you were not allowed to want anything at all. This was especially true for those who served the Empress Alexandra. She was a woman of fragile health and volatile moods, and those around her had to absorb that instability. Her maids were expected to monitor her without intruding, to intuit her needs before she voiced them. To fail in this, to bring her the wrong shawl, to misread a gesture, was to become the cause of her suffering, and that was unforgivable. Many servants turned to religion, its only sanctioned refuge. Lichens lined their quarters. Prayers whispered in candle-lit corridors became the only way to express pain. To cry was weakness. To complain was treason. The physical conditions were no less brutal. In a palace designed for spectacle, servants lived in narrow halls and airless chambers. During grand banquets, they stood motionless for hours. In winter, they froze in poorly heated wings. In summer, they sweltered in wool. Their meals were plain, if they came at all. Their shifts had no end, and they never once touched what they polished. They dressed royalty in furs but owned none. They prepared caviar but dined on boiled cabbage. They cleaned china plates worth more than their annual pay, and yet they stayed. Why? Because the court gave them purpose. Even if that purpose came at the cost of identity, to be a palace servant in Russia was to surrender who you were and become what the court needed. You were the background to history, the ghost behind the throne. The eyes that saw everything, and the mouth that spoke nothing. The trauma this caused was generational. Some turned bitter, some drank, some broke under the pressure. Suddenly, quietly, without record, others learned how to endure. They learned how to breathe without sound, how to wait without thought, how to be in a room without being noticed. And in some cases they learned how to hide dangerous truths. Several accounts from late Romanov staff describe whispers of unease, as revolution stirred beyond the palace gates. Even loyal servants knew the world was cracking. Some wept for the future, others stole what they could. A few, brave or foolish, chose to stay. They stayed through the exile, through the hunger, through the silence that grew between orders, because for them, the palace was not just a workplace, it was a life, and losing it meant losing everything they had ever known. Their stories were rarely told. History remembers the Romanovs, the assassins, the generals, the marble rooms. But not the girl who folded Alexandra's scarves, not the boy who trimmed Nicholas's beard, not the cook who prepared the family's final meal. These were the shadows behind the throne, loyal to the end, invisible by design, and in many ways more tragic than the royals themselves, because they had no power, only proximity. And sometimes, proximity to power is more dangerous than defiance. When the revolution finally came, many palace staff were executed, exiled, or simply vanished. Some were betrayed by the very people they had served. Others were left behind to clean rooms that would never be used again. And then the silence returned. Not the silence of obedience, but the silence of erasure. Their uniforms were packed away, their names removed from rosters, their sacrifices buried beneath politics and new regimes. Today, tourists walk the halls of the Winter Palace. They see the chandeliers, the oil paintings, the golden banisters, but they do not see the footsteps worn into the floors by servants who never left. They do not feel the tension that still lingers in rooms where one wrong gesture could end a life. They do not hear the voices, whispered prayers, quiet warnings, mumbled orders that once filled every shadow. But now you do. Because now you know the truth. The empire didn't rest on the Tsar's shoulders. It rested on the backs of the ones who held the coats, lit the lamps, stood beside the door. Russia's invisible army did not carry swords. They carried silence, and they paid for it with everything they had. They called it the Winter Palace, but inside the air was warmer than the name. Carpets cushioned the silence. Painted ceilings glowed with candlelight. Servants moved like clockwork. Nobles bowed at thresholds. The Tsar's children laughed in long corridors. And then, it all shattered. The story of Russia's fall from monarchy to revolution isn't just about kings and ideologies. It's about the people caught between power and survival. Those who stayed, those who ran, those who whispered secrets, and those who died, keeping them. This is the story of loyalty and betrayal, and in the halls of the Winter Palace, both wore the same uniform. To serve the Romanovs in their final years was to step into a burning building and pretend the air was safe. The empire was cracking. Outside, workers starved, soldiers muttered, newspapers fanned flames. But inside the palace, etiquette persisted. Tea was poured, boots polished, curtains drawn. The staff knew change was coming. They heard it in the guarded whispers between officers. They saw it in the tightened security at the palace gates. And yet many stayed. Some out of fear, some out of habit, but many out of something deeper. Take Countess Anna Hendrikova, a noblewoman and loyal attendant to Empress Alexandra. She was not merely a servant, she was a confidant. She bathed the Empress's children, managed her letters, and shared her faith. When the Romanovs were forced into exile, Hendrikova was given a choice. Stay behind and live, or follow them into the abyss. She chose loyalty, and was executed by the Bolsheviks for it. Her story isn't unique. Elizaveta Erzberg, Anna Demidova, and several other women followed the family into exile, clinging to ritual as the world around them collapsed. They ironed linens in Siberian cold. They read prayers over empty plates. They bowed in rooms where no thrones remained. All this wasn't blind loyalty. It was conditioned devotion, forged by years of silent obedience and royal proximity. To them, the Tsar wasn't a political figure. He was routine, and routine is hard to betray, but not everyone stayed. As the palace descended into uncertainty, a quiet unraveling began. Some servants disappeared overnight. A valet who'd once trimmed the Tsar's beard quietly returned to his village. A kitchen maid slipped out during a shipment delivery and never came back. There were no goodbyes, just sudden absences. And in those absences, the cracks widened. Whispers grew louder, which staff still supported the royal family, who might be feeding information to the revolutionaries. Fear became a form of currency. In such an atmosphere, betrayal didn't always look like sabotage. Sometimes it looked like distance. A servant standing 2 steps farther than usual. a tray delivered without eye contact, a favor declined with polite formality. The empress, sensitive to slights, began to suspect even her inner circle. She leaned more heavily on Anna Vyrobova, her trusted friend, a woman hated by many at court for her influence and mysticism. Vyrobova, loyal to a fault, defended the empress at every turn, but her presence deepened the divide. Servants who disliked her became targets of paranoia. One chambermaid was dismissed for speaking critically of Rasputin, not to the empress but to a fellow maid. Word traveled, punishment followed. In the final months before the abdication, tension at the palace was palpable. The royal guards, once fiercely protective, began showing signs of fatigue. Some fraternized with local workers. Others, resentful of poor pay, let revolutionary literature circulate behind closed doors. Servants, too, began hedging their bets. A few secretly sold palace items on the black market: candlesticks, linens, pocket watches, not to get rich, to prepare, to survive. Still others betrayed not out of malice, but desperation. One doorman reportedly opened a service gate for Red Guard infiltrators, believing they would spare him. He was never seen again. Another attendant, forced by interrogators to list the empress's confidants, complied, only to be executed days later as a loose end. Trust evaporated. Every favor carried weight. Every silence became suspicious. And yet, in this environment of betrayal, acts of stunning loyalty still occurred. Abdul Karim, the Indian servant once favored by Queen Victoria, had no equivalent in Russia. But a similar thread can be found in lesser-known figures like Pierre Gilliard, the Romanov children's tutor. Though not a servant by title, Gilliard remained with the family well into their exile, risking arrest to ensure the children's education continued. He smuggled letters, taught French in whispered tones, helped maintain a fragile sense of normalcy until the very end. Then there were the guards who turned their backs, literally, so the royal children wouldn't see their parents being searched. Small gestures, human ones, inside a palace that had forgotten what that meant. After the Romanovs were moved from the Winter Palace to other estates, what remained was a hollow shell. Rooms once filled with music and ritual were stripped. The court's rhythm, breakfasts, audiences, ceremonies, had vanished. The few staff who remained wandered like ghosts. Some looted, openly or discreetly. Others locked themselves in their quarters, too afraid to choose a side. The Bolsheviks, when they arrived, interrogated every remaining servant. Who did you serve? What did you know? What will you say now? And those questions had no right answer. Loyalty became a liability, silence became guilt, and betrayal, even imagined, could mean execution. In the months that followed, the palace was looted, stripped, and repurposed. Artifacts vanished, servants were scattered. Some joined the revolution, some vanished into the countryside. Others were swallowed by prisons. No monuments were built to honor the ones who stayed. No plaques list the names of those who chose duty over escape. But they existed. They held children's hands while bombs fell outside. They folded royal garments while whispers of rebellion echoed through stone walls. They served tea, knowing it might be their last, and still they did it. Because they believed in something, not always in monarchy, sometimes in routine, sometimes in memory, sometimes in nothing more than the idea that loyalty still meant something, even when it didn't. And what of the betrayers? Some believed they were freeing Russia, others acted to save themselves. A few sold information for food, a few more wanted revenge, but all of them had one thing in common. They lived in the same house, walked the same halls, and once, maybe just once, bowed at the same door. Because betrayal doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it's born from the same silence as obedience. Sometimes it walks in the same shoes, and sometimes it's the only way a person can escape the weight of loyalty. The Winter Palace is a museum now. Visitors walk its corridors, read placards, admire chandeliers. They hear the names of Tsars, empresses, generals, but the real story lies deeper. in the footsteps of those who stayed when they didn't have to, and the ones who didn't when they had every reason to. Loyalty, betrayal. In the Winter Palace, they wore the same face, and now you know the difference, because now you've seen the shadows, not just behind the throne, but beside it. You think of the Victorian era and picture top hats and corsets, candlelit drawing rooms, afternoon tea served on porcelain. A golden age, they say, full of elegance, invention, and empire. But elegance has a basement, and invention has a kitchen. The real story of the Victorian household was written not above, but below stairs, in the servants' wing, in the narrow beds, in the ringing bells that never stopped. This was a world with no applause, no rest, and no face. To be a servant in Victorian Britain was to vanish by design. You woke before the family. Always, if the mistress rose at 6, you were up by 5. If the master had guests, you stayed up until the last lamp was out. Most servants worked 16 to 18 hours a day. They had no weekends, no days off, no overtime, only expectations. And if you were lucky, you were merely tired. If not, punished. The servant hierarchy was a mirror of the house it supported. At the top stood the butler and housekeeper, often older, experienced and feared. Beneath them, valets, ladies' maids, cooks, footmen and parlour maids. Below them, the scullery maids, laundry girls, hall boys and nursemaids, young, exhausted and invisible. Each had a specific role, and woe to the one who crossed those lines. A chambermaid dusting the wrong room, or a footman appearing in the kitchen, might be publicly scolded or dismissed. In some houses, rules were posted on the walls. No talking, no laughing, no idling, no reading unless given permission. Even standing still in the wrong hallway could be considered loitering. The physical toll was relentless. Scullery maids scrubbed greasy pots until their fingers bled. Valets shaved masters who barely acknowledged them. Laundry maids dragged soaking sheets up narrow stairs. Servants often shared cramped, unheated attic rooms. Some slept in closets or beside the kitchen hearth. When allowed, they were fed scraps or plain stews, never allowed to dine with the family, even if they cooked the meals. And yet they were expected to look presentable, uniforms starched, aprons clean, faces polite. They had to smile while hungry, serve while limping, speak softly even when insulted. Discipline was constant. Servants could be fined for dropping china, spilling soup, or arriving 30 seconds late to morning call. Mistresses might withhold pay for a wrinkled bedsheet. Masters could dismiss a maid without notice for speaking out of turn. One known case from 1892 tells of Louisa Musgrave, a housemaid wrongly accused of theft. She was publicly whipped by her mistress. The stolen item was later found. No apology followed. Silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. You didn't talk back. You didn't talk much at all. You were there, but not present. Familiar, but nameless. To your employers, you were the girl, the boy, the help. Rarely a person, never equal. Visitors often remarked how well run the household seemed, how the trays arrived precisely on time. What they never saw were the feet behind those boots, soaked with blisters. The hands behind the trays, raw with burns. The eyes, sleep-deprived and sun-starved, that watched from behind the door. Even laughter was regulated. A giggling maid was flighty, a smiling boy, too familiar. Joy was a privilege for those upstairs. The psychological weight crushed many. Some servants suffered breakdowns, collapsing mid-task, sobbing behind pantry doors. But mental health didn't exist as a diagnosis. It was laziness. It was hysteria. It was failure. Homesickness was common, especially among young girls sent to serve at age 13 or 14. They wrote letters that went unanswered. They stared out frost-covered windows at streets they weren't allowed to walk on. Their only escape was religion, alcohol, or silence. But the system was built to keep them still. Servants were discouraged from marrying. Couples who worked in the same household often had to hide their relationship. Women who became pregnant out of wedlock were dismissed without severance. Some ended up in workhouses, others in worse places. And there was no appeal. The master's word was law. The mistress's disapproval was final. And yet, some believed in the system, because it offered certainty, because poverty outside the mansion walls was worse, because a uniform gave you status, even if that status erased who you were. A clever maid might rise to become a lady's companion. A footman might inherit a butler's place. But such mobility was rare and always conditional. One scandal, one false accusation, one illness, and it was over, and the memory of service didn't fade. Many former servants carried the rhythm of bells and footsteps for the rest of their lives. Some flinched at sudden noises. Others couldn't break the habit of apologizing before entering a room. Their time in service became a haunting, yet they left behind no journals. Few memoirs, most were illiterate or discouraged from writing. Their stories lived in ledgers, fines, punishment logs, and whispers, and in the lives of those they made comfortable. They were the ones who changed chamber pots at dawn, who fetched the brandy before midnight arguments, who stood outside doors during childbirth and death, who cleaned blood without questions, who folded clothes for people they were forbidden to speak to. They were the quiet machines behind the illusion of order, and sometimes that illusion broke. There are records of servants retaliating in small ways, slamming drawers too loudly, over-salting soup, hiding letters, refusing to curtsy. These rebellions were dangerous and rare because the fear of homelessness outweighed the desire for justice. One parlour maid, dismissed without pay after 3 years of perfect service, simply disappeared. Her name never appeared again in any census. No record of marriage, no grave. This was the final act of erasure. Victorian society prized control. Clean lines, quiet women, loyal men. Below stairs, those ideals became iron bars. And the people who held the keys rarely thought of the lives they confined. The family upstairs believed their comfort was natural. Their schedule, breakfast at 8, luncheon at 1, tea at 4, dinner at 7, was supported by a staff of 10 or more. A bell rang and a body appeared. A spill happened and a cloth was waiting. A fire grew dim and hands knew how to stoke it. And so the illusion continued, polished, fragrant, civilized, but beneath it, ghosts, living ghosts. Women whose hands shook from years of boiling laundry, men who couldn't stand up straight after decades of stooping, children born into service, growing old in silence, and all of them forgotten. Today, Victorian homes are museums. Tourists walk through parlours and gaze at portraits. They admire embroidery and gaslight fixtures, but the narrow servants' staircase is roped off. The cramped attic quarters are left unlit. The bells are silent, and the names, still missing. No plaques name the girls who scrubbed brass for 30 years. No velvet ropes mark the spot where a hallboy collapsed and was never replaced. No framed letter thanks them for decades of invisibility. But now you know, now you've seen what they carried, not just plates and pails and brooms, but the entire image of civilization. They were never invited to sit, never asked what they dreamed, never told they mattered, but without them, the house would have fallen, the meals would have stopped, the illusion would have shattered, and for a brief moment, beneath those floorboards and behind those curtains, something real might have been seen. There's a strange kind of silence that grows inside a palace. It doesn't come from luxury, it comes from the people who aren't allowed to speak. Behind every royal figure was a servant, and behind every servant was a name that history forgot. Lie to serve in a royal or noble household wasn't just a job, it was a transformation. You stopped being who you were and became what someone else needed. And in the process, your identity didn't just fade, it was erased, slowly, skillfully, completely. This wasn't always done with violence. Often, it was done with praise. You're so loyal, they said, so reliable, so trustworthy. Words meant to sound like gifts, but which quickly hardened into chains. Servants weren't just trained in tasks, they were trained in disappearance. How to walk silently, how to hold their faces still, how to be in a room without taking up any space. Their job wasn't just to serve, it was to vanish while doing it. In Versailles, court servants lived in the palace, but not in the world. They had their own entrance, their own quarters, their own air. Their presence was essential, and their existence inconvenient. They stood in silence during hours-long rituals. They handed perfumes and buttons in golden chambers, then returned to stone attics with no fire. The goal wasn't to honor them, it was to remove them. One servant wrote, "We were treated like flowers that only bloomed when needed, and when they weren't needed, they withered, quietly, out of sight." In Victorian Britain, it was no better. A footman might live in the same house as the family he served for 40 years and never be allowed to speak during dinner. A maid could cradle a newborn child, watch them grow, and still be dismissed without warning the moment she aged. The deeper the devotion, the more complete the disappearance. It started subtly. You were told not to speak during meals, not to laugh too loudly, not to question instructions. Soon you were watching your reflection fade, not just in mirrors, but in memory, in who you used to be before service began. Some coped by clinging to routine. They polished the same silver, folded the same napkins, lit the same fire each morning. Routine gave them rhythm, and rhythm gave them control. But inside, something was breaking. This emotional suppression wasn't accidental. It was a system in Tsarist Russia. Many palace staff were born into service. They didn't choose it. It chose them. Their parents were servants. Their futures were mapped. And so, from a young age, they learned to live without themselves. A valet might work from 4 in the morning until midnight. A lady in waiting might be expected to accompany the empress from dressing room to drawing room without speaking. If they cried, they were scolded. If they hesitated, they were replaced. If they rebelled, they were gone. There was no room for anger, no space for grief, no time for dreams. And slowly, this erasure grew permanent. By middle age, many servants couldn't remember what they wanted. They no longer knew what joy felt like, unless it belonged to someone else. Their emotions belonged to the household now. Their laughter was rationed, their pain ignored. Records from the Victorian period show an alarming number of nervous breakdowns. Some ended quietly, behind servant doors. Others were simply listed as unfit for duty and sent away. They weren't treated, they were forgotten. Hannah Culloch, a Victorian maid who kept a rare diary, wrote, "I was never myself when I served. I was a pair of hands, not a woman, a shadow with a duster." Her words were unusual, not because they weren't true, but because few dared write them. The expectation was silence, pride in endurance, but pride couldn't hold back collapse. In Versailles, when a valet failed to meet eye contact with a duke, he was slapped. When a maid fainted during a long ceremonial wait, she was dragged out like furniture. These weren't isolated incidents, they were rituals of control. The court didn't need individuals, it needed functions. Even those closest to royalty weren't safe. In Russia, Countess Hendrikova, deeply loyal to the empress, was seen not as a woman of intellect or independence, but as an extension of Alexandra's will. When revolution came, her identity meant nothing. She died beside the people she served, not because she was seen, but because she wasn't. And the greatest irony, the more loyal you were, the more completely you disappeared. Servants who sacrificed the most were rewarded with the least. They were not remembered, they were not protected, they were used and then erased. This erasure wasn't only social, it was internal. Many long-serving staff developed what modern psychologists would now call service trauma, a form of chronic dissociation caused by years of self-suppression. They stopped responding to their own needs. Some no longer felt hunger until ordered to eat. Others forgot how to rest without guilt. Their bodies worked, but their sense of self was gone. To the outside world they were praised, devoted, humble, hard-working. These were compliments carved from compliance. No one asked what those words cost, and the cost was staggering. Some servants lost families, estranged from siblings, unable to marry, forbidden from raising children. Others lost time, decades spent folding towels and pouring tea, only to be dismissed without pension the moment their hands shook. A few lost everything. One Victorian cook, dismissed after 30 years of service for being unsteady, spent her final days in a workhouse. She died without name or note, but her recipes still fed a household that never spoke her name again. They told her she was part of the family, and then they threw her away. This was the unspoken contract of service. You give your body, your voice, your dreams. They give you a roof, and when you're used up, they find someone else. Some tried to resist, quietly. A misaligned fork, a forgotten robe, a letter delayed. These acts were dangerous, seen not as rebellion, but as betrayal, and they came at a cost. Others coped by pretending it was a calling. They wore the uniform with pride. They memorized every protocol. They told themselves it mattered that they mattered. But late at night, when the bells were quiet, even they sometimes wondered, who am I, when no one's watching? And often there was no answer, because identity once erased doesn't return easily. The palaces these people served in still stand. The gowns are preserved. The portraits remain, but their names are gone. Their memories scattered. No plaques, no statues, no record of who they were before duty consumed them. But their loss lives on. In the silence that follows ritual, in the stillness behind thrones, in the shadows that never quite leave the staircase. They were more than servers, more than valets, more than cooks and maids. They were people, and they were erased. Not by force, but by expectation, by ritual, by generations who believed that dignity only belonged to those born with titles. And now you've seen what they gave. Their time, their selves, their truth. So the next time someone calls that life honorable, ask what honor looks like without a name. They dressed in fine cloth, polished gold, and walked stone corridors under painted ceilings. But they were not nobles. They lit the fires, folded the letters, bowed in silence. But they were not poor either. They existed in between, not honored, not despised, just forgotten. This was the life of the royal servant, trapped in the limbo of class. Society saw them as fortunate. They worked indoors, near power. They didn't plow fields or beg for bread, but they weren't part of the world they served. The dinner tables they set were not theirs to sit at. The silk garments they laid out would never touch their own skin. They were close to the center, and yet always peripheral. A noble had land, a peasant had a home, a servant had a hallway. This tension followed them across centuries. In Versailles, servants were dressed in powdered wigs and satin waistcoats, only to sleep in straw-filled garrets above the kitchens. Their hands smelled of citrus water and soap, but their beds smelled of mildew and soot. They stood in rooms gilded with mirrors, yet were told not to look into them. At court they were expected to be elegant, deferential, graceful, but only in the presence of their betters. Outside the palace, they were mocked by commoners for their airs. Too refined for the village, too low for the ballroom, they belonged nowhere. Their speech was policed, their movements choreographed. They had to speak properly, but not too confidently, move smoothly, but not too boldly. Every part of their existence had to communicate discipline without ambition. To be ambitious was dangerous. It suggested that you had forgotten your place. In Victorian Britain, the same contradiction ruled. A butler could quote the Bible, read ledgers, manage a team of servants, and still be called by his job title rather than his name. A lady's maid might know her mistress's secrets, tend to her health, even counsel her on matters of the heart. But when guests arrived, she was dismissed like background noise. These servants weren't sapped peasants. Peasants owned hardship. They could marry, drink at the tavern, gossip freely. Servants had rules instead. They wore gloves while polishing boots. They smiled at insults. They bowed to children, and yet their employers told them they were part of the family. A lie, repeated often, and deeply believed, because proximity masqueraded as acceptance. To be invited upstairs was a reward, to be noticed, a prize, a nod from the mistress, a kind word from the master. These became currency. They made the servant feel chosen, seen, safe, but it was an illusion. One mistake, one rumor, one shift in household politics, and that illusion shattered. And then they were reminded, you are not one of us. In Tsarist Russia, the paradox was even sharper. Many royal servants were nobly born. Some came from ancient families, degraded by financial collapse or scandal. Others were born into hereditary service. Both wore the same uniforms. Both stood at the same doors, but neither were considered equals. You could have titles and still carry trays. The Empress Alexandra's closest attendants, including Countess Hendrikova, were women of dignity and heritage. But when the revolution came, their class could not save them. They were executed alongside the Romanovs, not as aristocrats, but as traitors to the New World. Their deaths weren't just political, they were symbolic. The line between noble and servant had blurred, and no one wanted to remember it had ever existed. The same was true in Tudor England. Royal household roles were meticulously stratified. From the groom of the stool to the keeper of the privy chamber, every title signaled access. But access wasn't respect. Servants stood close to power, yet far from protection. They were trusted with secrets, but not with autonomy. They witnessed births, deaths, betrayals, coronations, but their own lives went undocumented. In many cases, they couldn't even choose their spouses. Marrying another servant required permission. Falling in love with someone outside the household was a risk to one's position. Even reproduction was controlled. A pregnant maid could be dismissed instantly. A fathering footman might be sent away in disgrace. And yet, these people were the glue of the household. The butler knew more about the family than the lawyer. The cook remembered birthdays. The valet handled grief, illness, recovery. They were confidants without names. This limbo tore at the soul. Too educated to relate to field hands, too obedient to be treated as peers. Many long-serving staff developed what we'd now call class dysphoria, a psychological conflict born from standing in two worlds and being welcome in neither. They wore the right shoes but never walked freely. They spoke the right words but never said what mattered. They earned trust but never authority, and the cost of that liminality wasn't just emotional, it was existential. They began to identify with the house instead of themselves. Their value was tied to their usefulness. When they retired or were dismissed, many couldn't adjust. They no longer knew who they were. Some fell into poverty, others into drink. A few took their own lives, unable to reconcile service with selfhood. This was the unspoken cruelty of in-between. Not hated, not loved, just depended upon and dismissed. Some embraced it. There are accounts of head butlers and senior maids who carried themselves with near-royal pride. They learned to weaponize dignity, to move with calculated grace, but even they knew it only worked inside the house. Outside, they were still servants, and that awareness never left them. Even in death, their status was ambiguous. Nobles were buried in cathedrals, peasants in parish plots. Servants were often buried in unmarked graves on the estate outskirts. No headstone, no eulogy, just a shallow pit near the toolshed. Today we look back at their uniforms with nostalgia. We admire their letters, their recipes, their loyalty, but we rarely talk about the price they paid. They gave up selfhood in exchange for stability, and when the system no longer needed them, it let them disappear. Their only sin was existing between worlds. And the world punished them for not choosing a side. Now the palaces are museums, the uniforms are costumes, the bells no longer ring, but the limbo remains. We see it in modern workplaces, in service roles, in invisible labor, people who stand close to power but don't share it. People who speak but are not heard. People who carry everything and are never named. So when we speak of class, don't just think of kings and beggars. Remember the ones in between, the ones who bowed too often to rise, who smiled too long to scream, who served so well they forgot how to live. They were trained to smile when broken, to bow while trembling, to say, "Yes, my lady," even when they hadn't slept in 3 days. Royal service was not just labor, it was emotional confinement, and its cost was hidden behind gilded walls. No one talks about the breakdowns, not in Versailles, not in Victorian England, not in Tsarist Russia, because silence was the uniform, and anything louder than silence was shame. Palace servants were expected to endure everything: exhaustion, insults, pain, without flinching. Emotional discipline was part of the job description. You didn't cry, you didn't complain, you endured, and for many, that endurance eventually collapsed. In Tsarist Russia, Countess Hendrikova's diary reveals the toll with chilling subtlety. She surrendered completely into the hands of God. That wasn't devotion, it was resignation. A woman of noble birth, reduced to an extension of the throne, who spent her final days praying for strength as the empire crumbled around her. She wasn't alone. Royal attendants in Russia lived in fear of gossip, punishment, or simply disappointing those above them. They performed rituals under watchful eyes. Any emotional display, grief, anger, fatigue, could be misread as rebellion, so they suppressed it. But you can only swallow so much before it turns inward. Even in memoirs, the language is coded. Servants collapsed, fell ill, or were sent away. But what they suffered was more than fever or fatigue. It was emotional fracture, a chronic condition of being unseen and unheard. In Victorian Britain, it was worse. There, the doctrine of the stiff upper lip reigned. Tears were weakness. Grief was blubbing. A word soaked in contempt. Maids and footmen were trained to stand still, even when humiliated. Hannah Culloch, a Victorian maid who kept a secret diary, wrote, "I cannot complain." That phrase wasn't modesty, it was survival. Doctors of the time occasionally recorded nervous collapse among servants. Sent home due to exhaustion, they wrote, "Unfit for duty," but these were euphemisms. What they meant was this person snapped. The bell rang one too many times. The voice shouted one command too loud, and something inside them cracked. Some of them ended their lives. Suicides were rarely documented. When they were labeled as madness, or worse, moral failure. Take Louisa Musgrave, a maid hanged in 1850 for killing her child born out of wedlock. Her death became a cautionary tale, not about injustice, but about forgetting her place. Even outside such extremes, servants lived under emotional siege. Long hours, sleep deprivation, social isolation, all delivered in silence. They had no one to talk to. No right to rest. If they flinched, they were weak. If they hesitated, they were replaced. At Versailles, the psychological toll was theatrical. Every movement was a performance. Courtiers and servants alike were expected to radiate composure. But behind the grandeur were rooms filled with sobbing women, sick men, trembling hands. Memoirs from the Duc de Saint-Simon mention nobles breaking down from the pressure. But servants, their breakdowns went unrecorded, not because they didn't happen, but because no one cared to ask. Even abuse was normalized. A princess beating her chambermaid was gossip, not scandal. Staff chased with sticks, slapped, humiliated. And still, they curtsied, because the show must go on. That show of duty, elegance, loyalty, was built on emotional silence, and silence has a cost. In the Tudor court, things were no better. Servants who disobeyed or displeased the king faced whipping, imprisonment, or exile. But even those who followed every rule often cracked under pressure. The records don't say depression, they say melancholy, or tired nerves, or nothing at all, because no one wanted to hear that the people who made the kingdom run were falling apart. Open grief was unthinkable. To lose control in front of the king was the greatest shame of all, so they wept in stairwells, cried behind barrels, bit their tongues until they bled, and some stopped feeling entirely. This wasn't resilience, it was emotional numbness, a survival tactic turned scar. Even the idea of healing didn't exist. There was no therapy, no sympathy, only prayer. Orthodox piety in Russia, Anglican reserve in England, Catholic decorum in France. Religion told them to endure, to suffer with grace, to bear their pain in silence, for it was noble, but nobility never visited their quarters. Their pain was invisible, until it broke them. Some servants stopped speaking altogether. Others developed physical symptoms, tremors, palpitations, fainting spells. Doctors called it hysteria. Today we'd call it trauma. One Russian attendant reportedly fainted upon hearing the Tsar's abdication. Another collapsed during exile. They were described as delicate. The truth was they were broken by years of vigilance, always afraid of saying the wrong thing, being seen in the wrong place. Others developed physical symptoms, tremors, palpitations, fainting spells. Doctors called it hysteria. Today we'd call it trauma. One Russian attendant reportedly fainted upon hearing the Tsar's abdication. Another collapsed during exile. They were described as delicate. The truth was they were broken by years of vigilance, always afraid of saying the wrong thing, being seen in the wrong place. But these rebellions were punished, not always with force, but with exile. One wrong look, and they were sent away, forgotten, and so they kept quiet. Even as they broke, they were not machines. They bled, they ached, they longed for recognition, but the system was designed to ignore them. Even when they died, there was no funeral, no moment of thanks, just a replacement, another name on the ledger, another body to bear the burden. Their suffering didn't make the history books, their silence did, because silence was the measure of devotion, and that devotion cost them everything. So the next time you walk through a palace, or watch a period drama, or read about royal courts, don't just admire the gold, listen for the silence, and ask what it cost to keep it so quiet. Most of history is told by those who gave orders, but in the shadows behind every throne, someone was listening. Someone was scrubbing the floors when the deal was struck, carrying the tray when secrets were spilled, lacing the corset while tears were hidden. They were servants, and sometimes they wrote it down. Their voices were rare, not because they had little to say, but because no one ever asked what they did leave behind. In journals, letters, quiet testimonies, reads like a confession whispered through time. Hall. Let's listen. Madame de Haussette was a lady's maid to Madame de Pompadour at Versailles. She saw more than most kings. They speak around me, she wrote, as if I were a cat or a dog. She wasn't bitter, only observant. She stood by her mistress through scandal, illness, political disgrace. Yet despite her loyalty, she remained invisible. Her account tells us that even at the height of French royal opulence, the servant class was treated more like decor than people. Du Halsey knew the names, moods, and manipulations of the court, but she also knew her place, just outside the room, listening, from another side of the palace. The Duke of Saint-Simon gave us a glimpse of how servants wielded secret influence. The groom of the stool, he wrote, held more power than most ministers. Because proximity mattered. Who you dressed, what you overheard, determined your quiet leverage. But that proximity came with risk. Many servants at Versailles, from valets to pages, left no record at all. Those who did, spoke in careful, coded language. One footman wrote of being corrected by his master after spilling perfume. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The silence between words said enough. In Victorian England, we hear from Hannah Culwick, a maid who left behind a rare diary. Her writing was raw, emotional, and painfully honest. "I wash my hands till they bleed," she wrote. "That's how I know I'm clean enough to serve." She documented not only her labor, but her sense of worth, tightly bound to how invisible and obedient she could become. Hannah even entered into a secret relationship with her employer, a well-off writer named Arthur Munby. Their dynamic was twisted, part performance, part repression. In letters, she called herself his servant in all things. But she also described longing for moments when she could stand upright, unobserved, and remember who she was. It's one of the clearest windows we have into what service did to the self. Across the continent, in Tsarist Russia, Countess Anna Hendrikova served Empress Alexandra with unflinching loyalty. Her letters reveal a woman torn between faith, duty, and dread. She followed the royal family into exile, helping care for the imperial children under armed guard. She never left. She was executed alongside them in 1918. Her last writings were prayers, not for her own life, but for the Empress's peace. Another voice, Anna Demidova, was a maid to Alexandra. In exile, she remained calm, even cheerful, helping the daughters of the Tsar arrange their belongings, pressing dresses they would never wear again. One account notes, she hid jewels in her corset to protect them for her mistress. It did not save her. At the end, she begged for mercy, not for herself, but for the Grand Duchesses. Her voice, too, is remembered only in fragments. Then there was Pierre Gilliard, tutor to the Romanov children. He wasn't a servant in the traditional sense, but his letters give us a different kind of insight. How those who served closely often loved deeply. He wrote of Anastasia's sense of humor, Alexei's suffering, the weight of trying to preserve innocence in a collapsing world. After the family's murder, he helped identify their remains. He never fully recovered. Not all voices whisper in grief. Some, like Abdul Karim, Queen Victoria's controversial Indian attendant, speak with complexity. His letters show a man caught between favor and resentment, elevated to a strange form of intimacy, but never accepted, resented by the court, mocked by the press. He called the Queen Mother. She signed her notes, "Your loving friend." And yet, after her death, he was dismissed, his papers burned, his voice nearly erased, but not quite. In all these stories, one theme repeats: devotion without security, affection without equality, presence without personhood. Even anonymous testimonies reveal the same. One Tudor kitchen maid confessed in a court record, "I dream of eating the bread I bake for the Lord." Another admitted to crying when she touched fine linens, not from joy, but because she knew she would never own anything so beautiful. In a Russian exile journal, a guard recorded how a scullery boy lit chapel candles. He said the Tsar should not pray in the dark. That boy was never named. No record shows what happened to him. Still, that small act of faith, his voice, survives. Even the Venetian ambassadors who visited courts across Europe noted the eerie composure of servants. Their mouths remain shut, one wrote. Even when blood has been spilled. Another described how maids stood by silently as queens sobbed. They didn't interrupt. They didn't speak. They remembered, because remembering was all they could do. Most left no journals. Most couldn't write, but their voices lived in the margins. In the words of those who watched them, punished them, or couldn't bear their absence. Today we walk through palace museums and see polished floors, ornate beds, royal portraits. We forget who made the beds, who cleaned the floors, who stood just behind the artist, holding a cloak, a comb, a silence. But the whispers are still there, in old letters, in cracked journals, in the stains on surviving uniforms, in a handwritten prayer, folded into a locket, in a servant's Bible with the words, "He sees me even if they don't." They remind us that history isn't made only by rulers. It's remembered by those who watched, who served, who endured, and who left behind, in their own way, a voice. You've heard it now. And once heard, it cannot be unheard. You followed every rule, you memorized every name, you stood when they walked, bowed when they passed, and smiled when they forgot you existed. You did your job, and still, history didn't see you. This is the ending no one talks about. Not the ball, not the banquet, but the silence left behind by those who made them possible. Because in every royal court, behind every coronation or gilded hallway, stood hundreds of invisible lives, lives sacrificed in service to power, but never invited into its light. They were not slaves, and yet they weren't free. They weren't poor in rags, but neither were they rich in memory. They were the unnamed hands beneath the crown. Versailles shimmered on the surface. The world saw chandeliers, silk gowns, mirrors that reflected only elegance. But what the mirrors didn't show were the bruised palms that polished them, the cracked lips of maids rising before dawn, the shattered nerves of valets terrified of dropping the wrong glove. They hauled candelabras and secrets alike. They cleaned vomit behind curtains while royal guests toasted honor. They watched kings weep, queens scream, and noble children turn cruel, and they held it all in silence. Because that was the rule. You don't react, you don't interrupt, you don't exist outside the job. At the Tudor court, the rules were iron. A servant caught leaving without permission could be arrested for vagrancy. Kitchen staff were fined for breaking dishes. Women who married without approval were dismissed. Some servants were flogged for speaking too loudly, and yet they were told their position was respectable. In Tsarist Russia, servants like Countess Hendrikova were noble by birth, yet lived like ghosts. They gave up dances, family, and dreams, not because they were cursed, but because duty became identity. She once wrote that she had surrendered completely, without murmurings, into the hands of God. It wasn't serenity. It was resignation. They weren't trained just to serve. They were trained to disappear, and most did. No portraits were painted of them. No statues stand. The pages of history left them blank. Some broke down under the weight of silence. The diaries mention fainting spells, tremors, and sleepwalking, masked as exhaustion or delicacy. The toll of living beneath power but never touching it was a kind of spiritual starvation. What do you become when your voice is never heard? In Victorian Britain, maids like Hannah Culloch left behind fragments of thought. "I am not seen unless I make myself small," she wrote. Smaller than dust, her diary spoke of endless obedience and the strange pride she took in being invisible, a pride that was really grief wearing a mask. She was lucky, she wrote. Most didn't. They lived and died in shadow behind stairwells in attic rooms, behind silk curtains filled with dust and rage. Some were known only by their duties: the cook, the wet nurse, the boy. Their names faded as soon as they could no longer work. This was the final cruelty. You could give everything, and still, the story would not be yours. In Russia, many servants followed the imperial family into exile. They scrubbed floors in freezing barns, prayed for monarchs who no longer held thrones, comforted children, while knowing they themselves would never be mourned. And when the Romanovs were killed, some were executed beside them, not because they were threats, but because they were near. Their loyalty became their coffin. Even after death, they were rarely mentioned. The memoirs of dukes and duchesses noted the lace on a dress, but not the woman who hemmed it. The weight of royal grief was measured in ceremonies, not in the bloodstains of the handmaid trying to stop it. The world remembers thrones. It forgets who dusted them. So ask yourself, how many lives must be erased for history to feel clean? You see their traces now, in the cracked leather of old servant journals, in the margins of letters where they wrote "thank you for the bread," in the sighs of exhausted hands that never signed their names. Even now, walking through the echoing chambers of palaces turned museums, their presence lingers. The quiet footfall, the half-cleared tray, the impression of weight in the corner of a royal painting, someone almost visible, waiting to be dismissed. That's who they were, always present, never known. And this is their inheritance, to be the machinery behind splendor, to be the soft background hum of power, to be there but never seen, until now. Now you've heard what they endured. Now you've glimpsed what was taken. Now you've seen the ones the portraits forgot. And in doing so, you've given them back something no crown ever did. A name, a witness, a place in the story.